ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time out to come into this QQI blended learning seminar. If you're having any technical issues or difficulties during this and you can't hear any of the presenters at any time, please let us know. The slide that Laura had up there, we posted in the chat if you want to have a look at that again if you're not familiar with using the Microsoft Teams. I know a lot of people are more familiar with the Zoom application. So just to get us started as quickly as possible, if you could just mute yourself when you come in. If you've difficulty with your connection, maybe if you turn your camera off as well. Most of the session will probably have slides up anyway. So thanks again for coming. Just to remind you all, we did mention it in our invite, we're going to record this session for colleagues that won't be able to make it for us to the session today. So we have targeted this event from a QA support perspective. So those supporting QA management, enhancement, those working in that kind of a context, as there are many different national fora and opportunities, tools and webinars for staff working in a teaching and learning forum. However, we do have our own teaching and learning forum with us, and we'll ask Alison Farrell to come in at the end there to remind us of the resources that are available for teaching and learning staff, which is good. But the purpose of this seminar is really to facilitate those who are tasked with that job of managing the academic environment in terms of quality assurance, quality enhancement, and of course linking that institutional policy or strategy on blended learning to the quality assurance context, and particularly the context in Ireland. So the idea behind this initial event really is to try and establish a programme for more focused events, maybe deeper dives on areas and topics around the whole blended learning area. So we have actually asked for your questions in advance, and thank you very much for many of you who have submitted questions in advance. Many of these questions will be answered directly by our QQI executive. All our staff are here on hands today to listen to you and to help out. That's staff that you're familiar with, and maybe staff that you're not so familiar with. So Walter Balfe, Deirdre Stritch, Peter Cullen, Sue Hackett, myself, Karina Maguire, should have introduced myself, stakeholder engagement, and a range of other colleagues that are here to support, and Brian Maguire, who's our Director of Quality Assurance. The idea again is that we will try and give you just a brief run around the blended learning quality assurance, the statutory quality assurance guidelines, and Brian will take us through that. He'll also look at maybe some of the teaching learning assessment quality assurance issues that came up during our report, which is all about the impact of COVID. And then we have Professor Mark Brown from DCU here to give us the expert view, and that I think is something that we're all looking forward to. So without any further hesitation, I will ask you to just maybe limit your questions. Limit your questions actually to questions that are really of interest to a very general audience. If you're actually asking very specific questions, we'll have to get back to you on that at a later point. Staff will follow up with you after. So if you're asking very specific relationship type questions, we will follow up in a different format with you. But in general, we will actually come back to posting all of the questions that you raised today and that you've raised beforehand in a kind of a frequently asked questions context, and post them out to everybody that is interested. So Brian, if we could have your presentation, please, that would be great.
Okay, just getting that up here. Good afternoon, everybody, and my name is Brian Maguire. I'm the Director of Quality Assurance at QQI. You should be seeing my slides shortly. There are we. Have we got slides yet?
Not yet, Brian, no. Yep, they're up now, yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit on the warm-up for our main featured speaker, who's Mark Brown. But I'm going to situate the QA, our impact on blended learning in the context of our wider QA guidelines system. And the context for this, of course, is that we've been going through dramatic changes in the way we're teaching and learning in the last few months. At the end of last term, QQI organized, collated a whole bunch of research from different sources, from the students' unions, from the institutions, from international sources, and these we pulled together in a report. My colleague Peter Cullen and other colleagues in QQI edited together a report, pulled together a report on the impact of COVID-19 modifications on teaching, learning, and assessment in Irish further higher education and training in higher education. And this is pretty unique internationally. In fact, we haven't seen any similar comprehensive reports on the impact. No doubt there will be coming along as time goes by. We wanted to get it together quickly so that we could help institutions prioritize and help ourselves prioritize the support we might give to institutions in this change times for the 2021 year. We know the campuses are reopening this week, and there will be communications later on today saying, notwithstanding any move in Dublin or other parts of the country to level 1, that the higher education, further education, or essential services and on-campus delivery will go ahead as planned, albeit with significant tightening up of things like physical distancing and requirement to kind of minimize any discretionary contacts or meetings or congregated groups. But we're reopening again for business this week, next week, the following week. And within that context, we want to see what we can learn from what happened last term. Okay, basic lessons from last term. Whether overall the pivot to the online learning succeeded, but not for everybody. One of the things that institutions have been scrambling to do, and indeed the national system in terms of providing additional devices, improving available bandwidth and so on, is to help to make sure that fewer people fall through the cracks in the coming year than maybe did towards the end of last term. The tertiary education system, however, did respond very dramatically, kept taught out the year, graduated students, helped to stabilize actually the whole national response by keeping a key part of our infrastructure going, that the teaching and learning continued. Another conclusion was that students were an influential group and that they supported each other. They did, from a QA perspective, possibly one of the interesting things was just how important learning outcomes were. How important learning outcomes were, and the institutions told us this, in terms of trying to sort out what was really essential to keep within a program. Assessments had to be changed, yeah, because you couldn't have sit-down exams, but the use of learning outcomes and the fact that so many of our programs, almost all our programs, are now describing learning outcomes related to the national framework, meant that we were able to zero in quite quickly on what was essential. And that was helpful in the quick response. It's also been helpful, I think, in terms of, and will continue to be important in terms of the continuing adaptation of programs in the coming year and years, helping to maintain confidence, for example, among professional regulatory bodies and indeed employers. The quality assurance processes that institutions and providers have in place had supported this rapid change management, oversaw it, the use of academic governance, the use of internal consultative processes for decision making meant that even though things were done very quickly, there were checks and balances, so that and that helps to ensure big mistakes aren't made. And I think that's been a feature of the responsiveness of the tertiary education system. ICT, of course, is critically important to enabling the rapid change, and that's what we're going to be. That's why we're picking up on the the blended learning guidelines in this particular seminar. Assessment was modified, but by and large, academic integrity seems to have been maintained. We won't be picking up on this a lot here today. We have already organized an event earlier on the month that some of you may have participated with the National Academic Integrity Network, which has really come into its own in helping to support institutions in responding to what are sometimes newer threats to academic integrity that come about in a blended learning or online learning scenario. Okay, so like I said, quality assurance is it's our business. What's next for QA? I'm going to take a bit of a look at our QA, brief review of our QA infrastructure. QQI publishes quality assurance guidelines, national quality assurance guidelines that apply to all education and training. We have a core, a core that applies to all providers at all levels. We have, and these are in accordance with the policy that we have for how quality assurance guidelines are used to influence institutional behavior and shape expectations of all the stakeholders on what to expect from the education training provision. However, there are differences between sectors, in terms of their scope, in terms of their resources, in terms of how they're organized. And so we have sector-specific guidelines. And we also have topic-specific guidelines. And these were designed to cover particular types of provision. So, for example, apprenticeship provision is one of the topic guidelines. And we also developed topical guidelines on blended learning. That was back in the day, sometime earlier this year, when blended learning seemed like something like an option, rather than an essential part of what everybody does. What are the guidelines? They are guidelines. They're not rules for exactly how to do things. They are guidance that providers have to use when they're establishing, designing, evaluating, maintaining, renewing, reviewing their own quality assurance procedures. And they're a basis on which QQI then knows what to expect from a provider when we organize our reviews. So the core audience for the quality assurance guidelines, the audience for the quality assurance guidelines are, yes, institutionally all providers. They help to situate the Irish system within a broader European and international system, so that helping to maintain that all important public international confidence and confidence in our peers in other parts of Europe and around the world, that the Irish system has ways of both self-correcting, but also giving evidence of how it is striving to maintain quality. And so the principles are: the primary responsibility lies with the provider. QA requires planning, resources, and commitment. Planning can be rapid planning, and obviously we've all gotten used to much more rapid planning than maybe we would have had to be previously in the last few months. But it's also not always big plans. Continuous improvement requires small adjustments. And one of the things about the blended learning environment, and we'll hear maybe later on about it, is that it actually can facilitate early detection and early feedback and correction of aspects of delivery. Systems enhance transparency, and so even in a hurry, it can be important to, in fact, it becomes all the more important to communicate, to sustain confidence, to communicate with all the stakeholders, particularly the students, particularly the staff, so that all can be on the one page, on the same team. Okay, I think I've already said that the role of the providers is to operate their own QA system and to adapt those to the new environment. And that can mean new ways of gathering information. Give an example. that it's going to depend too on the way in which the provider is scale, the way in which they've organized their internal QA arrangements to date. These may need to be adapted. We've seen, for example, that our own external quality assurance activities, both reviews of institutions and approval of providers and review of and approval of validation of programs, has actually now gone virtual. And so we have virtual site visits, virtual training of panel members, and so on. So the quality assurance activities themselves can also go change and modify. The detail of that is probably for another day's seminar, but the point is that all of our activities are changing at this in quite rapid succession. Underpinned by ICT. So, as I said, it was about 6 or 7 years ago that there was a rather notorious report called An Avalanche is Coming, about how online education was going to transform the institutions of post-secondary education worldwide, along the lines of, same as Uber had disrupted the taxi business, or Netflix was disrupting the digital streaming content, and all content is content. Well, it turned out that indeed there was a public natural disaster coming, but it was a real natural disaster, and that's actually the thing, rather than some kind of Silicon Valley technology push that has shoved online learning front and center in all our lives. It has, of course, been the pandemic. However, whether because we were afraid the avalanche was coming or not, QQI did a few years ago recognize that there are unique characteristics of blended learning, of online learning, that require modifications to the way we think about what quality assurance procedure, what quality assurance is required. How do we know what's good, and how do we know how to make it good and keep it good when learning is delivered online? Even the idea of delivering learning, when there's engagement between students and the institutions that are organizing the learning opportunities for them, when these take place other than in a face-to-face campus environment. Somebody's run ahead of this. So we devised an approach to good practice. We set up an expert group spanning further and higher education. The focus throughout the guidelines is raising awareness of the issues that are particularly pertinent to online and blended learning. We've used blended learning. The terminology itself is sometimes a bit contested. Originally, the guidelines were drafted as for flexible distributed learning, but then they changed focus online in the context of blended learning. And but we won't, I think, get hung up on the difference between blended learning and hybrid learning in today's discussion, unless people want to raise that in discussion, maybe with Mark later on. But it assumes, blended is that there is some online learning, online provision, assuming some face-to-face as well. And we know that that's what the Irish institutions, by and large, have opted for. The public policy decision was that we were not going to go entirely online, that most programs, certainly all institutions and most programs, will retain in the coming year significant elements of face-to-face on-campus experience. And the question is, how is this complemented by the online learning experience? The guidelines are structured in a way that looks at 3 different layers, if you like. There's the organizational context, which is the strategy for planning for blended learning, the infrastructure and resources, the published expectations on blended learning, the relationship between Irish institutions and learners who are either by design or by circumstance outside Ireland. We saw that last term. A number of students had to be supported when they returned to their home countries. with consequent problems with things like time zones and even internet access and geo-blocking and things like that. And then the organization collaboration also organization context also includes how to collaborate with other partners. Headings for under the program context are the program outcomes, of course, and learning results. And as I said, learning outcomes are key to what keeps us flexible in the way we deliver our programs. Learning resources, materials, and delivery mechanisms. The approval and program validation process. And I know that certainly some of the providers who are offering QQI awards as opposed to being from designated awarding bodies have questions about QQI approval for modifications to their programs. We're not going to be dealing with those specifically in today's session, but we are live to the questions that are being raised. We are, you will probably remember that back in April, QQI lifted some of the constraints, conditions on validation to allow more flexibility in the mode of delivery. Those modifications, those relaxations will continue through the rest of this academic year. We're taking them through governance next week. And we expect that there are other changes that are being made. But just as we expect institutions, as they're modifying, as they're changing and planning, back to the organizational context, and using their program approval processes and their their regular quality assurance and feedback mechanisms, they will continue to do that and apply that. So in other words, it's not just that all bets are off. Quality assurance continues, and we'll hear a little bit more about how that might be done. The third category of organization in those guidelines concerns the learner experience, the context, the supports that are available, the whole range of supports that we normally expect to see available face-to-face, not just academic supports, but counseling supports, and specialist reading and writing services, tutorial supports, various specialist tutorial support services, that these will also be available to learners who are not able to come onto campus at a given point in time. And the learner experience also focuses on the equality of opportunity, the context of back to my point earlier that not all learners have the same wherewithal to approach. There's challenges of universality of the design of some of our learning experiences, particularly when they're done quickly and even on the fly. Those are the expectations. Back to the report I mentioned earlier, I'll just finish up by saying that even in the emergency circumstance of the pivot, the students' feedback was that the majority of colleges, majority of their colleges had provided online learning experiences, and the majority of the students, I won't go into the detail, but the majority of the students had actually expressed satisfaction that the online content offered to me was of good quality. 12% strongly agreed, 40% agreed, another 20% weren't so sure. I don't discount the fact that there were 28% who disagreed that the content was good quality. But, and I think expectations will be raised. It's one thing to change in midterm, it's another thing to start a year and design your whole academic year with a blended learning environment. But I think what happened last term augurs well for the kind of momentum that we have. The other point one point I'd finish up on is that the students and staff are still, we're all in this together. We want to sustain that collegiality that is the core of the college experience. I think this is why the avalanche never came, was because the avalanche was predicated on it being some kind of content that could be packaged and there was just alternative delivery mechanisms. Education isn't about the delivery of content. Education is about a relationship all of our relationships between learners and educators, all our education, all our relationships are now moving into a new mixed environment where there's an awful lot more happening through electronic media, and education is going the same way, and that's but we need to be kind to each other, as some, there was one tweet pointed out. I'll post the link in the chat. There was a radiography student in the UK who was being very empathetic to the requirements of the teacher, saying, you know, pointing out to their fellow students that, listen, you know, the teachers, if they're delivering lectures through Zoom or an online platform, they can't get the same kind of feedback. They can't see your facial expressions. They can't know that you're not missing it. So please come forward, use the chat facility, give them the feedback, take part in the surveys, join in the online discussions, make use of what's offered. And the final line was, be kind. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. And I don't think you're talking about being kind to us, so feel free, folks, to ask whatever questions you want. What we want to do for the next few minutes is my colleague Laura is going to attempt to try and take a poll for you, from you, on priority areas that we can develop a program of more focused events going forward over the next few months, for topics that will assist you. So over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Karina. So if you can just have a look at your chat window there, you'll see that I've posted a link. So if you can click into that link, it should open a new window for you. So this is an application called Slido. So we're just going to ask 3 questions. We won't bombard you. So at the top of the screen, you'll see there's Q&A and polls. So if you can click on polls, that will bring you into our first question. So the first question there is just multiple choice question, but you can choose more than one option there if you'd like to. So I'll leave that open for a minute just so that people can have time to read through it and try to respond.
Do you want to repeat that question for people who are not accessing the poll?
Sure. So the first question there, the first of 3, is what are the key challenges, other than resources, your institution or your organisation is facing as regards delivering blended learning programs? So we have a number of options there. So they are assessment, GDPR concerns, integration of student and staff support services, learning technology or resources, student engagement or motivation, student feedback, student participation in quality assurance, and there's an other box at the end. So I'll give you a moment before we move to the next question just to complete that one.
If people can't access the poll today, we certainly would invite emails from all participants identifying areas, topics, focused areas that, again, in the kind of QA realm that we can bring back to this series of events. So again, we're looking at bringing people like Professor Mark Brown along to give us really trusted experience of providers who've been through the wars on many of the blended learning issues that can provide good insight and learning for us. Also, please have a look at all of the chats that have been posted up by colleagues. The modified teaching, learning and assessment report links are there. If you haven't read it, there's plenty of good information in that. Should we move on, Laura?
Yeah. So I've just opened the second question there that should pop up on your screen now. And it is, if you have developed quality assurance procedures using the blended learning guidelines, how useful do you find the current guidelines? And your options there are very useful, somewhat useful, not useful, and my institution or organisation has not used the guidelines to develop QA procedures. So there are your 4 options there for that question about developing QA procedures using the guidelines.
And just to let everyone know, that last one is, they're all anonymous, so so feel free to be as frank as possible.
Very important to add that bit.
Yeah.
Just a reminder for people to mute. There's a couple of people not on mute. Do you want to reiterate the second?
Yeah, so I'll give it another minute there. So if you have developed QA procedures using the blended learning guidelines, how useful do you find the current guidelines? So the first option is very useful. The second was somewhat useful. The third is not useful. And the last is my institution or organisation has not used the guidelines to develop QA procedures.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one then, I think.
Okay, so this is our final question then. So this is an open-ended question, and we wanted to know which topics you would like to see discussed in future seminars. So which topics might be interesting or useful for you in future seminars?
So again, just in looking at those topics, to remind you, there are very, very many useful seminars out there for your teaching and learning staff, also for your students on the how-to around blended to get yourself started, to get them started. But this is really more around the management of the operating environment and the quality assurance context. These are the types of topics that we're looking for, topics around, you know, assessment, things like that. It's important, I suppose, that you look at the full realm of areas that QQI is working on at the moment. We have a couple of seminars coming up on assessment in collaboration with the National Forum, and we'll also post some details of that up as well. But, you know, we're looking for topics that are very, very prioritised and relevant for you at this time to help you in your task as we move further into the academic year. The very unusual academic year.
Karina, I'm just going to share my screen so that people can see the results that have come in so far. So I'll just show the results from the first question so people can still respond to the third one.
The third one is limited to just 25 characters. It's hard to put a topic in on 25 characters.
Okay, if you'd like to add something into the chat, you can do.
Yeah, or even just, you know, a couple of words should hopefully focus the topic, and we can get back looking for more detail. Sorry, we didn't catch that quite there, Laura. It was very quick.
Okay, sorry, my something happened there. Hang on a second. I just share again. Okay, so if you can see that there, so we had the most responses to the first question there, which was around key challenges that your institution or organisation faces. So I suppose the top 2 that people chose there were assessment and student engagement or motivation were the most frequently chosen options there, followed by learning technologies and resources, the integration of student staff support services, GDPR concern, student feedback and student participation in QA, and other was at 14%, not specified.
That's great.
Our second question was around using the guidelines to develop QA procedures. So 55% of people who responded found them somewhat useful. 21% said they haven't used the guidelines to develop QA procedures. 19% found them very useful and 4 said not useful. Our final one then, the final question was about topics for future seminars. So we used a word cloud just to bring those responses together. So I think we can see there that this student engagement and program validation were the most common or most popular responses there for options for future seminars. But there are a number of other options in there: assessment, re-engagement, online learning, e-portfolios, grade inflation.
Okay, that's great. Thank you everybody for your patience in that. I think we'll move on now to our star attraction today. Now that the worst part of this seminar is over, the guidelines, the statutory guidelines. But
Thanks,
again,
Rena.
we're open to feedback, anything at all you have in that context. Brian, do you want to say anything before I bring Mark in?
No, just to say that the guidelines, Mark was central to helping us devise the guidelines, and so it's great to have such an expert here in Ireland, and the resources that have been developed by the Irish institutions are of course key, and I mentioned earlier that students were impressed by the pivot to some extent by the pivot to online learning, and that is partly because of the work that had been done by the pioneers, all the people who had been ready and preparing for much more extensive use of technology supported learning and various blends. So welcome, Mark.
Okay, and maybe just to say, and really I suppose just to reiterate, we are actually very fortunate. If we were to read out Mark's professional resume, international connection, and you know, his work in this area, we'd actually need another seminar alone. So thank you very much, Mark. I know you're very heavily involved in some European Commission work at the moment, not to mention the pressure you're under at your own organisation. So we really appreciate you giving us the time and giving us that broad overview to get us started with this series of events. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. I'm just testing my audio is coming through and you're seeing my slides okay.
All good to go.
Great. Well, as you can see, I wasn't asked for a title, so I took the liberty of giving a title, which is a little tongue-in-cheek here: blended in part or blended at heart. And I think that's one of the challenges we face, particularly as we look past the current experience we're all managing at this point in time. I'm not sure I feel.
Sorry, you just seem to gone on mute there, Mark, for some reason.
I wonder if that's a little bug because it came up when I changed the slide, so I'll just keep an eye for that. I was saying I'm not sure I feel entirely comfortable being positioned as an expert in the field, but it was just under a year ago. Here I am, proudly in my Irish rugby jersey at the World Conference on Online Learning that we hosted here in Dublin, over 800 delegates from 80 countries. Who could have predicted back in November when that took place that online learning, well, it's often being described at the moment that the year 2020 will be known as the great onlining of education. Let's see if, I know my mic has stayed on, I think this time, yes. Also, apologies just because of the system challenges we face. I can't see the chat box in my window, so I dumped you a whole raft of links that I'm going to refer to during the talk. Normally, I would post those at a point of where I bring them up, but it was just more efficient to do so. So right now, we're actually involved in teaching a MOOC called Making Blended Education Work. That started 2 weeks ago now. We're on the second week. It's a 5-week course. Almost 4,000 educators doing that course, people who say that MOOCs haven't had an impact. I'm happy to have quite a challenging debate on that because earlier in the year, in April, we were part of a MOOC that we designed with a team in which 80,000 educators took on getting quickly to pivot to online education. and 20,000 of those educators completed that MOOC. And then a little more publicity, if you like. On Monday, we have a MOOC available right throughout the sector. We're very pleased to have had the Irish Universities Association as an associate partner with the DCU Student Union, a Digital Edge Essentials for the Online Learner. So this is something as an effort that we've picked up from some of the surveys that were being reported, that learning to learn online is not the same as learning in a classroom, and is actually, we would argue, an important life skill. And so we've actually, the diagram you see there, the figure, is a fusion of the new European Life Comp framework with UNESCO's Learning Compass. But enough self-promotion. What I want to do is cover in the very short time 3 things. I do want us to think a little bit more about our language, what we mean. How can we really blend with purpose, intentional strategic purpose, and very briefly towards the end, where to next, which is more the probably segue for the conversation, chat, and any Q&A we get. So that's the general roadmap. My whole academic career has been framed around this quote, and I say that not just in an academic sense, but also in an administrative leadership sense. Too often, I think in education, we're heavily engaged in covering up cracks. I'm quite happy to find the cracks, and I'm willing to put my hand up. I'm not sure if we've got any of our DCU Quality Promotion Office on staff in the MOOC, but quite happy to put my hand up and say that at DCU, the blended learning, the guide has not really had much of a role at all. So I think people were, I was quite surprised to see something like 60% respond that it had been partially useful or that you've been using them. And then when it comes to new technology in education, for me, I've sat back in some instances over the last 6 months and just had to smile at some of the ridiculous comments that have been made. There was one earlier this week that appeared in the Times, in actual fact, that just didn't warrant a response. I know quite a few educators did respond by tweeting. But it is the case that there is a rhetoric reality gap. There are other gaps. There's a gap between the here and the now, because what's good practice today, not just because new technologies change, but our understanding of pedagogy does evolve. And then there's a gap between the state of the art, what we could do, versus the state of the actual. And maybe that's very relevant to the infrastructural issues that we've been confronted with over the last few months. But without further ado, I would normally probably stop and just check the checkbox here, but I'm just saying that because I always feel the need to model good pedagogy, but because I can't see it, I'm not going to get out of the screen mode. What does this really mean? Blended education, blended learning has been around for a very long time. And to draw on one of my inspirations out of the arts from Ron Williams here, words really do matter. People who tell you they can't change the world don't really know the power of words. So I'm very particular about ensuring that we do think very carefully about these words. We've done this at DCU in the name that we have for our BLE, which we called Loop, which is not just the BLE, being part of a loop of learners, a loop of technologies. Many of you, I hope, have heard of DCU Connected, which is not DCU Online, but about the learning experience, being connected. Here we have a classical sort of description of blended learning. If you can see that enough in the middle, reduction of face-to-face contact time with some kind of online. I would argue these kind of simplistic definitions of blended learning are not overly helpful at all. And you'll hear why in a minute or two. And it is the case that there's still to this day, and this was something we had to grapple with when we were developing the QQI guidelines, there is still not an accepted definition of blended learning in the literature. I haven't posted a link to this one. I forgot about this, but I'm sure you can Google it. It's from last year, which still is talking about the various definitions and conceptions and what do we really mean. There's a limiting I wouldn't want us to get bogged down in this debate, as you'll see, but it is important that we are aware of this, because blended is not the same as online, and this is an article that is closed, so I didn't post the link for that reason. Some of you may not have access to the journal, but this is a very good article, quite recent again, about the various definitions of online. So we don't even have an accepted definition of online learning, believe it or not. Again, I don't want to get too pedantic about this, other than to say, anyone involved in institutional surveys or national surveys, this national survey from Canada is worth noting, because what they do in their national survey, they've only been doing it for 2 years now, this will be the 3rd year, they actually offer some definitions, but they ask the participants whether the definitions they provide resonate with them, whether they are the same definitions they adopt in their own institution or not. You've got definitions on this slide for blended, hybrid, and then in the smaller ones, online and distance. And the standout is that a large proportion of people actually don't have the definitions that are being used in the surveys. So a methodological issue is, if you're surveying people, staff, students, and you're using some of these terms, don't assume that everyone is working off the same definition, even if you give a definition. But nonetheless, this comes from earlier in the week in the MOOC I was referring to, that I'm doing in my, if you like, part-time evening role as one of the co-facilitators. We asked the question whether they really thought blended learning was still a useful concept, and most people still see it as a catch-all term that has merit. So I certainly wouldn't argue, despite it not being well defined, that this is not a useful concept. What we are seeing nonetheless, and DCU falls into this, is a move in language away from the term blended to hybrid. Again, you could think we're playing semantics here, what's in a term? Well, the term hybrid, as my image tries to capture, is about grafting different approaches together. And I won't say just face-to-face and online, because you'll see I'm going to be talking about other things shortly, and getting something better, because that's what you do when you develop a hybrid. And I don't think that that's always been the thinking underpinning blended learning. It's just often been blending more things to continue to do what we've always done, just maybe differently. So I've said on a number of occasions already that I think we need to have a broader conception of blended education. I'll use education at this sense, but this time you'll hear why. So there are other ways of blending. So at the moment, we've been talking largely about blending on campus with off campus in class. And for me, this is sort of like the new learning ecology here, which is hence the background that I have. But actually, when we're talking about learning, a lot of learning takes place out of class on campus when we're back on campus. In fact, arguably, as much, if not more, learning that's valuable takes place outside of the classroom. But too often we don't think about that, and we certainly don't measure it, shall we say, from a quality perspective. And then, as we now are aware, actually that learning is also going on off campus, out of class. And I'm going to give you an example of this, because I'm not just talking about the students in study groups on WhatsApp. There are other things that we can be doing. Here's an example of what we do at DCU with our DCU Connected, our fully online students. And it's also an example of public-private partnerships, you might add, borrowing from the health discourse. Here is a company called Studiosity. It's an Australian company. Almost all Australian universities use this service to provide a 24/7 online study coach, as well as a 24-hour turnaround on writing feedback on student assignments, on draft assignments. And I'm going to share some real data with you from DCU. So here's some usage data. I can't remember whether this is a particular month. I think it is from a particular month, because we get these reports every month. And the thing to take from this is, here's an example actually of an unbundled service where the students are making use of the service well outside of regular hours, when our normal service would be closed. And as you can see from the bottom figure, 7 days a week. In actual fact, usage, on the weekends, no drop off whatsoever. So that's an example of blending a service and blending a learning experience that goes well beyond what takes place in that classroom. And from a quality perspective, I only threw this slide in about 20 minutes ago when I realized really who I'm talking to. Every month we get a service report, which I don't get from some of our other services, to tell us how satisfied our students are. And with this particular service, having used it now for 3 years, we are still at a 98% satisfaction rate, either somewhat satisfied or extremely satisfied. So we have some pretty good real-time data, and you get qualitative feedback as well. Ultimately, summing up this first part with an eye on the time, we can do many things when we're blending or hybrid, whatever terminology you want to use, and I'd be advocating that you have your own institutional terminology. But I'm much more interested in enhancement for reinvention than enhancement just for incremental change. This particular diagram, as you can see from the reference, comes from a report published by the National Forum, so it's a useful sort of way of thinking. But of course, it's not mutually exclusive. You don't have to be at one end of that continuum or another. And I think you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to break my own policy here, and I'm just going to push on. I'm on a roll rather than because I'd have to get out of the presentation mode. Unless, perhaps I'll pause, and is there a question or anything that's come through that you can perhaps relay to me and I can answer as I catch my breath?
I suppose the issues coming up at the moment are as anticipated, I think, Mark, assessment. So it's the quality assurance of all the alternative assessment pieces. Also tensions with professional bodies, and the question of organisations that need to provide everything online, fully online. So they're anticipated issues. And of course, student engagement was something that came out of the survey as a top concern, which is good to see. We are also well tuned into students, and they're here today as well.
So I guess, as you already foreshadowed in your poll, you've really got the next year's worth of webinars and all those topics. I'll touch on some of them. The engagement one, there's a very good article that actually one of our team have just recently published that I can follow up if you want the link. It's in an open access journal on online engagement. But I will touch on the assessment and some of the institutional perspectives in the time I have available, which I know is running out quickly. Blending with purpose. So I did send you a link to a European funded project. This is the project that has produced the MOOC. It's called the Embed project, and we've developed this maturity model. So the MOOC, this maturity model underpins it. Now, I'm not actually a huge fan of the model that's been developed because maturity, to my mind, is actually quite a problematic concept. What's mature today might not be mature tomorrow. And, you know, under the classical maturity models, what happened with COVID-19 is institutions had to become mature really quickly. So it proves that you can do it much more quickly than perhaps a linear type model might suggest. But I'm flagging it because, like the guidelines, the QQI guidelines, these drill down from the institute, the program, and the course level. So they're just another set of guidelines to look at. They do have case studies that come with them, and more case studies will. Some of the cases are in the MOOC. Some of them are video cases, so you'll get them there, but they'll be added to the website in time. At the course level, a couple of things I want to ultimately pull out here very quickly is that, you know, at the end of the day, the student learning experience is what they have to do, which is why assessment is so important. And it's that design of the individual module. If you don't have the design at the outset, then you're not starting from a strong foundation. So design as a metaphor, I think, is really important. And I talked about needing to have a wider conception of blended learning. I'm talking about blending the pedagogy, because if you're not engaging and thinking about how you blend pedagogy, in other words, blending learning from listening and learning by making and learning by doing and learning by sharing, these flash terms that you could add with the theories underpinning them, but effectively this kind of pedagogical compass where what you're wanting to do is ensure the blends you're designing engage learners in many of these different kinds of activities, not just learning by listening or teaching by telling, which still is what's being done online down a pipe. Here's a design framework that you could use. I know this has actually become quite popular in Ireland. This is the one that we're using at DCU, the ABC Learning Design Framework. And I don't really have time to unpack it, other than to say this is about consciously and intentionally making your decisions about designs. In terms of the learning type discussion, in my last institution, what we did every semester is for every module and then every program, we would divide the number of discussion posts in a forum by the number of students to have an average of how many posts are being posted by a student on a semester basis, just as a really high-level KPI. That's not the kind of pattern that I've seen happen much in Ireland, just to get a sense of, if we see online interaction important, as this taxonomy for digital learning just published by the British equivalent, the Quality Assurance Agency, only about 2 weeks ago, which might be worth you pursuing as well, from the perspective of different levels of engagement and thinking about blending in that sense. Ultimately, though, what we know is that this is about changing mindsets, not developing skill sets. And so that's a very big challenge. And I could talk at length, and I've got an eye on the time here, so apologies, I'm going to run myself just a few minutes extra if that's okay. At the program level, I'll give you a few more QA examples. So the framework here is perhaps less important. It's not totally dissimilar from QQI's, apart from the fact one of the big barriers we have in Ireland is when workload is measured by teaching hours, and blended learning assumes that you can reduce contact to engage more online, you run into a structural problem in the way that workload's measured, and a real barrier. But ultimately, that question of assessment, if you're not thinking about assessment as a design at a program level, and a bit of self-promotion here, I'm sorry, but it's just a slide for this point, that assessment needs to be looked at program level. And from a quality perspective, drawing on the frameworks I've used previously, it's what you're wanting to look at is the blend of assessment appropriate? Are students getting different types of experiences? That's a quality measure, that they're not getting all the same thing. And then perhaps of relevance from a quality perspective is these are things that actually down under is very common. So an example, my last institution for feedback on assignments, we had a system where we monitored how quickly student feedback was returned on a KPI basis of 7, 14, and 24 hours, 24 days, and red reports would be produced when students had not received their feedback within 21 days. Now, there's a cultural dimension to the staff. Academic staff would hate a system like this, but these are interventions because we know how important feedback is for learning. In terms of evaluation, in your student evaluations on a module basis or even a program basis, are you asking questions about the student learning experience from a blended perspective? And then there are tools, these are off-the-shelf tools now that share that feedback directly to the learner. So this is closing the loop, that the students actually get the feedback that they gave. So you're providing evidence of what actions you're taking on a continuous basis. Quality Matters may be of interest to you. At DCU, we're the first European university to join Quality Matters. Quality Matters is the single most common quality framework for online blended education. It comes out of the US. You have to customize a bit of the language. I can't go into detail. I've sent you the link. Part I've just kind of run myself a bit tight on the time. Probably the outcome of a meeting yesterday where I kept throwing more things in. This is quite a good resource from the Commonwealth of Learning. I know there are some resources already on the QQI website from the Commonwealth of Learning. I'm reluctant to share resources from COLD, given that Ireland's not a member of the Commonwealth, but this is a recent book. So I'd point you in that direction. Institutionally, there's lots we could talk about. I guess we need to be strategic. You might want to explore this UNESCO tool. I did not post this one, but this is a dynamic tool that allows you to get a visual representation of where you are at in blended learning at an institutional level. And it produces a really nice report for you, a spider diagram, you fill in gaps and so on. And then ultimately in all of this quality stuff at an institutional level, stuff in inverted commas please, ultimately what we know from a lot of the literature is it's about building a quality culture. And those quality conversations are more important than any frameworks you might have to manage things, because culture eats strategy for lunch. And so those conversations you can actually foster and in many respects measure as well. So wrapping up, because I'm over time now, where to next? Where are we going? Well, I guess what I'd be saying is I think what we need to be thinking about what we're going to do tomorrow, next year, and then 5 years. Obviously, the 5 years is ultimately how we really harness the experience of COVID-19. I could talk at length. Maybe I can get an invite back to do better justice to what I've had to really rush over today. But I think what I'd be wanting from a quality perspective is not just talking about what are we going to do, but what are our KPIs? What is it that we say we're going to do, and how will we know we've done them, and set targets along the way? That's a very down under approach to things. It doesn't always work, I know, in a European context. Ultimately, it's a quality culture, and the nano is just as important as the macro at the institutional level, because the macro is made up of all the nanos, and I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know. And this is a version of what I gave you previously in that continuum from the National Forum. Where is your institution going to emphasize? Is it just enhancement, or is it truly redefinition? Is it about bolting blended learning on to what you're already doing, or reimagining? I know where I want to put my attention, but institutions have different issues, and even capacity has to be taken into account. I think I'm on my last slide. Oh, sorry, I have got one. Final comment, tongue in cheek, because I didn't say at the outset, because I assume these days that people know I'm not from these parts, but drawing on my in part or in heart, what I would argue is, regardless of the language you use, whether it's blended, hybrid, online, digital, or any other term, what you really need is to take this to heart and be bold. Now is not the time for us just to do small things and small measures. I really do think we are living through different times post-COVID-19. And my challenge to you is, what's the one thing that you might do to enhance the quality of blended learning in your own organisation in a bold way, at an individual but also institutional level? I won't talk about that. I sent the link. It's a good read. And that's my final word. And I have to apologise. It didn't quite get the timing right, or the cover. And I hope I did enough justice for you to have a lot of questions there in the QA. And I'm going to just exit out of the screening to see what's in the chat and hand back the mic.
Thanks, Mark. That was quite a whirlwind, and I suppose it really reflects the experience that you have. So thank you very much. There's an awful lot of information in that, and I think without question we will be having you back. So there is one question in there, all right, and you might not be able to find it immediately. Do you think the blended assessment approach should link with the blended learning delivery? If you can maybe comment on that. But I know you did say that assessment is really a dedicated focus seminar in its own right.
Well, I think the thing about assessment is pragmatically, the student experience, putting aside what I gave as examples of how the student has an experience outside of the coursework, ultimately a student does what they have to do to pass the module or the course. So the assessment is at the core of their experience. So you can redesign the student experience if you redesign the assessment. In some respects, you can be a little subversive. I'm talking here from personal experience when we're working with program teams, because ultimately I want to work with program teams, not with individuals. That's where you're going to get the biggest return. And if you're not addressing the assessment, then you're not really addressing blended learning and the affordances and harnessing the opportunities that are available. I think one of the great things that took place, and huge credit, as was said at the start, that most educators embraced. They had no choice, but they did embrace looking at alternative forms of assessment. And I know at DCU, I haven't got a strong evidence base for this, but I think we're seeing more creative forms of assessment now for this new coming academic year, potentially more engaging forms of assessment, hopefully where feedback is also part of that plan.
Okay, are there any more questions before we wrap up, folks? I see we're losing a lot of people who obviously want to get their lunch before their next engagement, which is also important. We did say we'd come back to focus topics, but now that Mark can read the chat, are there any more questions for him at this particular point?
Certainly, assessment seems to be a very common theme.
Yeah, assessment seems to be and that's actually no surprise, because again, that came across quite strongly in the COVID impact teaching learning assessment report that we did. Okay.
One observation I would make from the quality perspective is, what evidence do you have of substitution? Because if people in blending are going to introduce something new, what was taken away? So you really need to know that something's been taken away for what's been added, and you may be able to even keep a register of that or do a survey or an audit, because if you're not careful and you haven't followed the principle of substitution, you've increased the student workload and you may find less engagement, because there's a direct correlation here between what you're asking students to do and the level of credit value assigned to that. And just because it would be great to get the students, and this is a very real example from someone in my team, thought that it would be great to get the students, instead of doing an essay, to do a video 5-minute documentary. But actually, anyone who's worked with video will know the time it takes to create a short video is enormous. And so understanding the payoffs, these are all quality decisions, actually.
One of the other comments that you made, Mark, maybe just as a final wrap up, just to keep everybody, I suppose, calm and confident in this particular space, was about keeping things simple. And I suppose, all around the fact that the blended experience is not there to, if it can, fantastic, if there are opportunities, but it's not necessarily going to resolve problems that existed pre-blended or pre-COVID in our previously normal context.
Well, that's where absolutely the organisational cultural issues, they're a whole, blended. It's not and equally, it's also a scapegoat for why things haven't been done well. So, there are, at the end of the day, if you haven't got your money on your mission and it's not part of your strategy, then there are going to be enormous challenges. And part of that, of course, is professional development of staff. And another quality question for you is, maybe it's a broader than just quality question, how many staff have actually engaged in a fully online professional development course? Because if you haven't experienced it as a learner, it's a bit rich to say that our teachers are designing really engaging online learning, or even blended learning, when they have not done it themselves. Right now, I didn't promote this one, well, I guess I am now. We're running an online course for Irish educators. We closed off registrations a couple of days ago at 500, because we do want to have really good interaction in that. But one of the best takeaways was actually being on the other side of the fence and realizing how difficult it is.
Okay, and student engagement seems to be a big concern as well. So it's actually it's important to engage, and we certainly will be doing that with the NSTEP and also with USI, who are here today. So just getting back to previous comments, QQI will collate all of the wonderful resources. We might try and pull some out of the PowerPoint slides as well that Mark has presented. Colleagues have presented quite a lot of links and resources here as well. So we will collate all of those, we'll send them back to you. We'll also collate any of the questions and we'll prioritise the issues, and then we'll send you more information out on those deeper dive events that the team here will be involved in establishing in the very near future, and bringing Mark back again and other experts. And thank you for the advice that has been provided as well. I see there's a few people who are fully online already, willing to give advice. And of course, we have our own online college for quite a long time, which is Hibernia College. Could we please ask Alison, just to remind people again that there are quite a lot of national, international resources, webinars, tools available. Alison from the National Forum now, if she wouldn't mind just throwing up a couple of links for the benefit of those who are not familiar with the Resources Hub at the National Forum, that would be fantastic. So Alison's posted that in her chat. So the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning are obviously busy collecting resources for the teaching staff. Some of those also apply to students as well. And Alison, over to you quickly. Thanks.
Hi there, thanks Karina for that. I've sent a slide into you, maybe you can pull that up. If not, that's no problem. We have developed a number of different resources that are available on the website. I've put our website up there at the moment, and everything that I refer to is in the website. Perhaps I could share the slide if we can't find it there with QQI. But I guess the most important things, based on what Mark is saying, is to draw attention to the fact that we have a lot of professional development online and through the open courses, and also through, on an ongoing basis, through the National Forum seminar series. So that series will begin again on the 1st of October, and we've prioritised any seminars that relate to remote, blended, online, hybrid, whatever we want to decide to call it in our context. And so they have been prioritised this year. We also have a number of resources that we've developed collaboratively with folks like USI, which deal with assessment and consider the different elements associated with alternative assessment approaches. And just finally to mention that we're working very closely with students. So we have a student associate intern as part of our staff in the National Forum. Thanks for sharing the slide there, that's great. And we're establishing a student associate assembly at the moment, where we will have representation from across very many of the HEIs. So we think that everything that we're doing, everything that Mark has said, and all of the comments all day have been around centering our focus on the students, and that's really what we're trying to do in all our work in the National Forum. All of the links in the slide are live, but if you have any trouble getting to any of the information, my email address is there and our website is there. And I'd be delighted to hear from you. I recognise a lot of the names in the participant list, and then there are other ones that you don't know, but we want to connect certainly with the sector and hear what the issues are. Thanks very much, Karina.
That's great, thanks. And just to remind everybody that the forum resources, although a lot of them are established with and for the higher education providers, they're totally and utterly applicable to the further education and training providers, both public and private, and the Forum have always made those resources available to everybody, including some of their online courses. Okay, that's great. Listen, thanks again to everybody. Thanks in particular to our speaker, Mark Brown. We'll stay connected with Mark because he is like his own Orient Express, speeding through the evolution of blended hybrid learning. And thanks to Brian, and thanks to the team in QQI. And we will be in touch with you folks to let you know what's coming up next. So thanks again. Take care, everybody, and best of luck in the new academic year. We are thinking about you, and having done that TLA report, we certainly feel for you.